There we go. Perfect. So thanks for joining me today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kara Beatty, and I'm the Senior Manager of the Conformity Assurance Network here at GEC. And so I want to talk to you about the Servers 2019 and the Computers and Displays 2020 criteria amendments. So that's the only item on our agenda today, and there are quite a few slides, so I'll get right into the background. So minor amendments were published to the servers criteria in December 2019 and to the computers and displays criteria in April 2020. We originally planned to implement these revisions in 2020, but due to the ongoing impacts and constraints from the COVID-19 pandemic, GEC decided to delay the implementation process of these amendments. So in June of this year, we did seek feedback from the Technical Conformity Assurance Committee about the implementation of these amendments and whether we should go ahead. And so I'll give you a little bit of background on the TCAC. So EPEAT seeks technical guidance and expertise from the TCAC, and the purpose of them is to provide input about specific issues about EP criteria, including when and how updated criteria should be implemented in EPEAT. So the TCAC is open to all stakeholders, as was the meeting in June, and there are no standing members. So based on the feedback we received after that meeting, EPEAT is implementing the 2019 server and 2020 computers and displays amendments. So we have determined that both amendments are minor criteria revisions. So I will get into what that means on the next slide. But based on the fact that they're minor criteria revisions, participating manufacturers must ensure all EPEAT-registered products come into conformance with the minor criteria revisions by December 31st, 2021. So I've linked our Conformity Assurance Implementation Manual in these slides, which you will get a copy of after we do all of the time slots for the webinar. This is also available in your registry accounts. You can access the policy manual and the implementation manual. And the implementation manual identifies the requirements for minor criteria revisions. So these are ones where the scope is limited to correction and changes and updates to the text to clarify existing requirements. There's usually no obvious reduction of points for EP registered products. There will be some review that is required, but it's pretty small that it likely won't result in manufacturers having to unselect criteria or remove products or change tiers in the registry. And the estimated time frame for implementation is 1 to 2 months after the publication of the revisions. So of course, as I mentioned, they were published a while ago and we just did delay it due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're also providing until the end of 2021 to implement these changes, just to give a little bit more time since we do understand that there are still delays due to the pandemic. P66, our implementation manual, also identifies the implementation and documentation review requirements for both the priority verification pathway and the certification pathway. So for both, the deadline is still December 31st, 2021. And in both, participating manufacturers are responsible for reviewing the applicable changes to your criteria and ensuring continued conformance with the criteria. If for some reason their conformance is no longer demonstrated, then manufacturers must unselect the criteria or archive the impacted products. And CABs are responsible for working with the manufacturers to complete the review as needed for the criteria that are impacted. So this is documentation review or annual renewal in the certification pathway. So going with that, I just wanted to let you know that CABs have been informed of all the criteria changes and will be reaching out to you as well to collect information. And you are reminded that you must work with your CABs on documentation review as needed. So you are responsible for reviewing the criteria changes and making sure they don't impact conformance. If for some reason you do realize one of the changes in the amendments impacts your conformance, please work with your CAB to resolve it. So as I mentioned, you will get these slides and we will make a copy of the recording available as well after we do all of the webinar time slots, because as we go through the remainder of slides, you will see there are quite a few. So I just want to make sure you know you'll have a copy afterwards. So we'll start with the servers criteria because it is there's fewer changes in the servers amendment. So in general, the amendment was updated The amendment updates all references to Energy Star so that the current version of Energy Star is always referenced. So in the definition section for both the definition of computer server and a product, the text was changed so that the definition of the server aligns with the most current version of the Energy Star program requirements. There is a required criterion to maintain Energy Star certification, or at least continue to meet Energy Star. So that we wanted the definition of a computer server to follow what's in the Energy Star requirement, since that is a required criterion. And then the annexes were also renumbered. So Annex A through E are now known as either normative or informative annexes, 1 through 4 and 1 through N4, and Annex 1 and I1. And then there were 2 criteria that were updated based on that Energy Star change. So it was 552 and 553. And just as a summary, the changes don't require additional documentation review to address the amendments, but we'll still go through the changes just so you know what has been changed, so you can see the different text. All of these changes are incorporated into the server's 2019 document. So if you have that most recent copy, you'll see all these changes. If you don't have a copy, it is available on the EPEAT website, but we'll still just walk through them really quickly. So the first one is 552, which is reducing energy loss from power conversion. And in the text, it says that the product shall be tested using the methodology specified in the most current version of Energy Star. So it used to reference one of the version numbers, and now it's been updated to say the current version. So why this doesn't impact your conformance? Well, one, Criterion 511 is already requiring products to meet the current version of Energy Star. So all the products EPEAT-registered will already have to have met the current version of Energy Star. So that means any of those products meeting the current version of Energy Star will have been tested with the current version, so they're still conform with 552. And just a few other notes, because our conformity guidance materials get into more details about what other evidence is necessary for 552. So our conformity guidance materials give examples that, in addition to providing the Energy Star report, participating manufacturers can provide product documentation and the 80+ report that specifically shows the power supply operates at the higher AC power voltages, 400 over 230 or 480 277. So if you've when working with your CAB, if you also provided those documentation, that's not impacted by the amendment, so additional documentation review is not required. If you did provide the Energy Star test report, but then maybe some other testing other information other than product documentation and the 80+ report, I do encourage you just to double check that you don't have any questions about your continued conformance for this criteria, but as I mentioned, we don't expect documentation to be conducted for this criterion. The next one was 553, which is about logging certain metrics identified in Energy Star. So again, the criterion used to reference version 2.1 of Energy Star, but now Energy Star has moved on to version 3. So the criterion is just now referencing the most current version. So it will encompass any future iterations of Energy Star as well. So Energy Star version 2.1 and version 3 and the annex in the criteria document that also includes metrics for this criterion all require the same metrics to be logged. So currently, you do not need to do an updated documentation review to this criterion because all the metrics that were being tracked before are still sufficient. But I just want to point out that, of course, there might be future iterations of the Energy Star versions in the future. So potentially in the future, there may be more metrics that need to be logged, but there's no documentation review required at this time. So that's it for the servers amendment for anyone who was just interested in that part. Does anyone have any questions before I move on to computers and displays? Okay, I don't see anything in the chat right now. So the computers and displays one is quite a bit more lengthy. So first, I just want to let everyone know that when you go to the EPEAT website, there are links to obtain copies of the computers and displays criteria. There is the 2018 version and then there's the 2020 amendment, but you need both documents. Only the changes that were made in 2020 are in the 2020 amendment. So you do need the 2018 version to look at criteria that weren't updated in this amendment. So please make sure you have copies of both documents. Since there were so many changes, we're first going to look at the changes that just impact the references and definitions. And then we'll look at the criteria where documentation review will be required and where we maybe think that documentation review will be required, or we just recommend that if cabs have made changes, they reach out, or if manufacturers have made changes, they reach out to their cabs. And then we'll look at all of the changes that don't impact conformance, and we'll talk about why they don't impact conformance, just so you have a record of all of them. So in general, all references to EICC were updated to RBA, as well as references to SEP 50001 were updated to the Superior Energy Performance 50001. So this was in the references and definitions section, but it'll also see it throughout the criteria. So there was one criteria we identified with significant enough changes that do require some sort of documentation review. So overarchingly, we need a declaration for verification requirement A and updated supplier declarations for verification requirement C2I. But I will go through all of the changes in the criterion, including ones that don't require documentation review while we're reviewing this criterion. So the first change was that supplier letter was changed to letters, so plural throughout the criterion. I've underlined some of these instances. So of course, many of you have received different supplier letters from your multiple suppliers. Maybe you've gotten amended supplier letters from suppliers. So you probably do have multiple supplier letters, and that's completely okay. Whatever you have is still acceptable in the terms of this part of the criterion. The language for selecting not applicable was also updated to align with the fact that this is actually a corporate criterion. So the language has been clarified to say that a maximum of 2 optional points may be claimed for this criterion if all products declared by the manufacturer to conform to this standard do not contain flat panel displays, manufacturers shall declare not applicable. So this was already how the registry assigned this criterion. It was already a corporate criterion in the registry. So manufacturers have already been making the appropriate declarations for yes, no, or not applicable. But this just clarifies it in the criterion text. So there's no additional documentation review required. Then verification requirement A was slightly updated. So it used to require documentation of the calculation, and now it requires a declaration. So this is a small documentation review that's required. Manufacturers will need to supply a declaration to your cab. You could turn your previous calculation into a declaration document, and you will still need to provide your cabs with this list of suppliers that make up 75% of your spend so that they can determine, what supplier letters are necessary for conformance. So that can be included in your declaration as well. So it's probably pretty similar to the evidence you've already submitted. And this is just an example from our conformity guidance material of a declaration with various suppliers and their spend. So this includes all that information in one declaration. And then the biggest change in this criterion was verification requirement C2I. So it was updated to align with the criterion text. So on the left, I have the previous verification requirement, and on the right, I have the new one. So you can see that if the supplier was excluding certain emissions because they were using emission control technology, they needed to provide a supplier letter that declared all of these items. They now need to provide a supplier letter that is declaring these items. So there is a change here in what needs to be included in the supplier letter. Abatement technology is quite commonly used to reduce F-gas emissions. So I do imagine that most manufacturers who are claiming this criterion will be impacted by this. So that's why we've identified it as something that does require documentation review. So you will need to obtain updated supplier letters and provide those to your cab. This is just an example from the conformity guidance materials of a supplier letter that's addressing that specific part of the criterion and the verification requirements. But of course, there's lots of other parts to this criterion which suppliers are declaring conformance to. So this is just covering that example, but all other aspects of the criterion still need to be met. Any questions on that one before we move on to criteria that may require an updated documentation review? Okay, we'll move on. So I've identified 4 criteria here, and they may or may not require documentation review, just depending on the evidence you've submitted before and whether you plan to make changes. So the first one is 4422, which now allows for information to be available in a video format, and we'll go into more details about each of the criteria after. 4621, there was an update to kind of clarify a discrepancy between the criterion text and the verification requirements. So based on that, there could potentially be the need for additional documentation review. For 4931, manufacturers can use, it clarifies the scope that manufacturers can use for facilities. So if a manufacturer chooses to update their scope, they may want to have their CAB review it. And then the last one is for 4932, which required certain information to be publicly disclosed. And now it gives a little bit more flexibility to allow information to be disclosed upon request. So if the manufacturer would like to change that option, then they can ask their CAB just to review it. And I just received a question about our previous criterion, and I'll go to that before I move on. Yes, so this is an example that came from the conformity guidance materials, I believe, but I can double check that and make sure that the example is posted in the conformity guidance materials that you have access to on the EPEAT registry. Yeah, no problem. So yeah, so this one again for 4932, just depending on if you choose to update your public disclosure, you may want your CAB to review it to make sure everything's conformant. So we will look at these criteria in more depth now. So 4422, as you can see, I've underlined the text that has changed. It says that the information could be available in a PDF and HTML, which includes a video available online, or IEEE standard 1874. So if you already did have your information in a video format, as you consider that HTML, then that is acceptable. However, if you have maybe a PDF or a web page and you really want to make some of the information available for this criterion in a video format, you're certainly more than welcome to. And this is just when we recommend you reach out to your CAB so they can make sure all the information you put in the video still meets all of the criterion requirements, just so that nothing gets lost in the translation from the web page to a video. So it's documentation review is not required. It's just an area where you might want to reach out to your CABs if you're making that change. And then you can see in the red text, there's the full title of the IEEE 1874 standard was removed from the text, but that does not impact your documentation previously submitted. So next is 4621. And again, there were some changes for this text that don't impact conformance. So we'll talk about those before we talk about the one that might need review. So the criterion previously used the terms user removable rechargeable battery and removable rechargeable battery pretty interchangeably throughout the text. And so the criterion name and text were updated to just call it a rechargeable battery take back program throughout the criterion. But the criterion always included this clarifying scope language. It always confirmed that it was a corporate criterion where the manufacturer provides a take-back program for user removable rechargeable batteries in declared products. So even though it's been kind of cleaned up to be consistent throughout the criterion, the scope is still the same. So this doesn't impact your conformance to the documentation you provided before. And then again, just based on that, this clarifying sentence was added that the manufacturer shall demonstrate that the rechargeable battery take-back program, which is inclusive of user removable rechargeable batteries, meets any of the options in the criterion. And then the statement for non-applicable was also just updated to really solidify that if all products declared by the manufacturer to conform to this category do not contain user removable rechargeable batteries, then the manufacturer may declare not applicable. So again, the scope was the same between both versions. It's just a bit of the cleaning up the language here. And then a footnote was added regarding the external communications. So whatever option the manufacturer was choosing to demonstrate conformance, they needed to let purchasers know that they offered the battery take-back program or they were participating with call to recycle or something. So that was always a requirement. Now this footnote just confirms that your external communications may or may not specify that it's for user removable rechargeable batteries. So that just gives a little bit more flexibility in your external communications, but no additional documentation review is needed there. So this is where the big change is. On the left, there's verification requirement B in the old version, and on the right is verification requirement B in the new version. So as you can see, verification requirement B had requirements to meet all of these different requirements. But the criterion text had requirements A through E, and there were slight differences between the criterion text A through E and verification requirement B. So these didn't quite line up with what was in the criterion text. So there was a bit of a discrepancy there. So the verification requirement was updated to clarify that all of the conditions A through E in the criterion text are what needs to be met for this criterion. So because there was a little bit of discrepancy there, I think it's possible that manufacturers could have looked at through A through E, or they could have looked at a verification requirement B. And just to add to that, this edit clarifies the exact requirements if the manufacturer is using option 1 in the criterion. So if you're using options 2 or 3, then this won't impact you, but just so you want to take a look through what you are doing in different countries for battery takeback and what's in the criterion. And as I noted, the criterion text includes some additional requirements that were not included in the verification requirement, such as the condition A itself was really focused on making sure the collection, transportation, and processing of batteries is in conformance with applicable laws. And then D and E, this one's a little bit more specific on manufacturer requiring service providers to provide information on the batteries collected, and that the actually requiring the batteries to be processed for extraction and recycling of selected chemicals. So that wasn't quite called out in verification requirement B before. So I want to make sure that all manufacturers are conformant. So if you originally conducted initial documentation review following the text and the verification requirement word by word, as opposed to the criterion text, you will need to do a small amount of additional documentation review to make sure all of those conditions are being met. So you will need to work with your CAB just to make sure that you have data for all of those items. All right, that's it for this criterion. Next is 4931. So as you can see, I've crossed out the part of the text that's been removed. So basically the manufacturer has two options here. The scope can be all facilities that have significant responsibility for the design and manufacture of products declared to conform to this category, or it can be one or multiple facilities that use a certain amount of energy of at least 70 million kilowatts or 50% of the manufacturer's total energy. So where it got kind of confusing because this statement says any facility, building, or operation owned or leased by the manufacturer could be included, but then this one said that the scope needed to include products declared to conform to this category, which is what you're doing in option A, but in option B, it seems to be applying that it could be any of the manufacturer's owned or leased facilities. So the text was updated to remove that statement, and it does make it a little bit clearer here. So for option 2, it really does clarify any building owned or leased by the manufacturer can be included in coming up with this 70 million kilowatts or 50% of total energy for the scope. So EPEAT has clarified that to CABs already, that as long as the facility, building, or operation is owned or leased by the manufacturer, it could be included. And we did clarify that products outside of the scope of this criterion could still have been included in those calculations as long as it was owned or leased by the manufacturer. Therefore, documentation review isn't required, but if you originally did do option 2, only factoring in your sites that were producing EPEAT products, you do have a little bit more flexibility. So if you do want to update your calculation, you can ask your CAB to re-review it and make sure all of your evidence is conformant. So again, not required, but I just wanted to point out a few areas where there were like significant enough changes where you might want to see if there's anything that applies to you. And then in this criterion as well, there were a few smaller changes. So again, URL was changed to URLs and document was changed to documents. So we've already been respecting that and doing documentation review with that in mind, but I just wanted to let you know that that has been changed in the criterion text. And again, the SEP 50001 protocol references were all updated. And then for 4932, there are some similarities. The references for SAP were updated, as well as the Korea SAP program references were updated. URL was changed to URLs again. Then there was some change to just the formatting of the scope. So for a lot of criteria, manufacturers look at their top X amount of suppliers based on their annual spend, based on a fiscal or calendar year. So the way that it was worded was just changed into like a more, there's just brackets in different places and stuff now. That doesn't impact your spend analysis or your conformance, but it just changes a lot of the text throughout the document. So if you're wondering where some of these changes are. 4932 also confirms that, well, it was always acceptable to have a multi-site certification with different facilities listed in that certification. It just rewords it in a slightly different way. So instead of saying if the certification is multi-site, it has to include the facilities in scope, it says that the certification can be standalone or in a multi-site certification. And then there was a little bit of, this is where we really get into the meat of the change of this criterion. So the original text in the criterion required the manufacturer to either disclose the certificates for energy management or the energy improvement values from the most recent 3 years or most recent year for the facilities in scope. So what has changed is now that it says the manufacturer can disclose the certificates or a listing of the certified facilities by city, state, province, territory, and/or country, or they can disclose the copy of the certificates. And for this option, they can make the energy performance improvement data available upon request for those facilities. So it does give a little bit more flexibility for you as a manufacturer for your disclosures. And we did previously indicate that manufacturers could actually give a list of the certified facilities instead of putting all the certificates directly on their website. But when we made that clarification, we didn't confirm that the listing must include the city, state, province, or country. So I've just underlined that text again. So if you've always been disclosing a list of the certified facilities, you'll want to make sure that that list does include all of this information. So you will need to check that. You might need, if you need to update anything, then you'll have to get your CAB to review that. And then for the energy improvement, if you've been disclosing the data, you can now make that information available upon request. So I would just recommend, if you're changing your website, to just have your CAB look at it so that it's still very clear that you're conformant to the criterion and what information is going to be available upon request, just so that you don't run into any problems in the future, maybe in a continuous monitoring round or something. So that's it for the criteria where there could be a documentation review that we recommend. We then move into all of the criteria that were amended slightly. So I just want to pause before I dive into all of them and see if anyone has any questions. Okay, great. So there's a lot of criteria here, so we're not going to go into too much detail on each of them. But for each one, I'm basically going to either underline or highlight the change that was made. And then for some of them, we'll talk about why it doesn't require additional documentation review. So for the 4151, the only change was that and was changed to and or, because a substance will receive a benchmark score and it'll either be 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. A substance won't get a benchmark score of 2, 3, and 4. So that is why they put and or in there. So that's the only change there. For 4110.2, this is very similar to the FGHG criterion we looked at that did require updated documentation review, but the changes in this one don't require one. So it's pretty similar, but without an additional documentation review required. So again, supplier letter was changed to letters throughout the criterion. And then the language for selecting not applicable was updated, but our registry had always identified this as a corporate criterion. So all of your existing selections are okay. Verification requirement A was updated to be a little more clear, but both of them still require a declaration that the manufacturer is meeting the requirements of this criterion. So if you've submitted the declaration before in documentation review, that is still sufficient here. And then there were some small changes to the text in verification requirement B3, but as you can see, just from even quickly looking at them, they're very, very similar. I read through it and the changes are so small that it doesn't require you to obtain a new supplier letter to address that change. And then for the criteria related to post-consumer recycled content or bio-based content or IT-derived content, all of them used to exempt external components that were integral to the operation of the product and sold with the product. And all of the language has been updated to just say external components sold with the product. So this doesn't impact your previous documentation review. A good example is if you were registering a desktop that had an external keyboard, you were always able to exclude that external keyboard from these criteria, and you still can. So this means that you don't have to update your documentation. In 4321, the word comprised was changed to composed, and you'll actually see this change occur in a few more criteria, but that was the only change here, and this was just an additional details section. So again, the evidence you've provided, such as the list of plastics, marking codes, and everything that is necessary for this criterion isn't impacted by this small change. In 4322, the word comprised was also changed to composed, but again, the same thing, all the evidence you've provided before to show the plastics are composed of a single resin is still valid. In the additional details section for 4322, the reference to 100 grams was removed because 4322 only applies to plastics greater than 25 grams. There's no set of requirements for plastics greater than 100 grams. So it was just a little confusion or a little bit of error as to why that was there, so it was removed. For 4412, this is about long life rechargeable batteries. So the two parts that were underlined in green were added. So it clarifies that the criterion applies to batteries that provide primary power to the product and that it should be tested in accordance with IEC 61960 and is modified by the criterion. So the criterion did include the testing parameters already, and we have always known that this has applied to the primary battery in the product. So all the testing you've done and stuff in the past still is conformant with this criterion. And then this additional sentence to really clarify that the criterion does not apply to separate batteries that provide power to external components was also included. So we already knew that, but another example is a keyboard or a mouse that might come with a product. They might have a rechargeable battery in there, but this doesn't apply to those components. And then the reference to the IEC test method was updated. So all this text was just updated to IEC 61960. That's just because if this is updated then over time, we're always referencing now the newest version of IEC 61960. Okay, so then for 4513, I've underlined the text that is new. So it says test results shall be validated or the internal power supply shall be tested by an entity who's accredited with 17025 or witnessed and supervised by a ISO 17665 certification body. So these ISO requirements were always in the verification requirements. They just were added in the criterion text now to make sure that there is clarity and harmony between the criterion text and the verification requirements. And then this part about test results being validated was added. And so you'll see that it was also added in the verification requirement language. And then, as I mentioned, that it always did require the ISO options in this text. So this is an example from our conformity guidance materials. We did clarify with CABS after this criterion was published that EPRI is considered to be an acceptable lab for this testing, even though they are not ISO accredited. So the 80+ test reports for internal power supplies, we were allowing to to demonstrate conformance to this criterion. So those test reports are validated by EPRI. So that's the addition in the text, is just to clarify that the EPRI lab reports were always meant to be accepted for this criterion. And then for take back, there's a couple changes to several of the take back criteria. So for first and 4611, the verification requirements were reordered. And so at first glance, you see that it requires a take back program that's either compliant with national laws or that the manufacturer is providing their own take back program in the country. And then on top of that, it says there has to be information describing the take back service and how to utilize it, and any information on direct costs. So this reorder of the verification requirements makes it seem like that regardless of whether you use a government approved program or your own take back program in a country, it makes it seem like A, B, and C must all be met. And that doesn't match the guidance we gave before. But the reason that there is actually no change is that the criterion always included this language in the 2018 and the 2020 version. It is always stated that in jurisdictions where there are existing laws or regulations which establish, sanction, or require the establishment of a program for the collection or recycling of products, demonstration of compliance with those legal requirements meets the requirements of this criterion. So that says that as long as you can demonstrate that legal compliance, such as the EU WE directives, all those take-back programs in Europe, then that meets the requirements of this criterion. So therefore, our same previous guidance and clarification always has remained the same. If you are participating in a government approved program in a country, you just need to show that aspect to be conformant for that country. If you're providing your own program, then you have to demonstrate conformance with A2 about providing your own take-back program, as well as B and C, where you're informing customers of the availability of that take-back program, since it's not governed by law. So that's what we've always been saying. That's what's always been enforced with this criterion. I just wanted to make sure that everyone still knew that was the case with the slightly rearranged verification requirements. And then for 4631, there is a part, this criterion is all about making sure that waste that is collected is recycled through government approved programs or through recyclers that meet certain qualified recycling standards. And so the criterion also has those quote exempt programs, which are things like warranty and product servicing programs or leasing programs, where the manufacturer still gets products back and then there might be scrap or residual components that have to be recycled. And so the criterion has always said that that scrap has to be recycled by a recycler that was certified to a qualified recycling standard. But of course, if you're participating in a government approved program in a country, you're going to probably recycle it through that program. And again, EPEAT has already said that that was acceptable, but this is just now solidifying that in the criterion text that, for example, if you're in France and the products returned from your warranty program, you can recycle them through that government approved program instead of going out and trying to find an R2 or Easterts recycler just to recycle that scrap versus already participating in your government approved program. And then in 4631, for the qualified recycling standards, it does give 4 examples: Easterts, R2, EN 50625, and Wheelabex. And then now a footnote has been added that Wheelabex is being replaced by EN 50625, which was again always listed as an acceptable standard in this criterion. And one thing I want to point out is that participating manufacturers, you're all already required to maintain conformance over time, and this includes updating expired certifications. So while documentation is not required when you're getting those updated certifications, I really just wanted to point this one out because I think it would be good to proactively check with your recyclers who were Wheelabex certified to make sure that they are transferring over to EN 50625, because it's a little bit different than just the certification expiring and them renewing it. This is them making sure that they're actually transferring from Wheelabex to the EN series. So again, documentation review is not required, but I do recommend being proactive to make sure that all of your Wheelabex recyclers are now EN certified. All right, so for 4192, The same language with the brackets around determining suppliers based on annual spend, either fiscal or calendar year, was modified, but that doesn't impact the suppliers in scope. The multi-site thing was also updated to just clarify that, again, it was always acceptable to have a multi-site certification, but that just changes the language about how it can be a standalone or a multi-site certification. So there was no significant changes there. 4922 has the same updates around the spend language. And again, it changes URL to URLs. 4941, this is related to renewable electricity use. So this is verification requirement 4. So it previously said that if hydroelectric power was used to meet the requirements of the criterion, the manufacturer needed to provide documentation that each source was certified to LEHI. But now it's been updated with the language from the criterion text that confirms it has to be certified to LEHI if such certification was available in the countries which the hydropower was generated at the date of the publication of this criteria document. So while this looks like a big change, this was always in the criterion text, and this is always how we have assess this criterion. This is just, again, harmonizing this verification requirement with the criterion text by copying that language directly into it. And then for 4942, which is renewable electricity use for suppliers, there's the same kind of changes and edits that we've just looked at. And then there was just a little bit of clarification added. So this one relates to suppliers. So each supplier in scope has to meet a certain amount of renewable use. So this just adds the statement for each facility. So it's confirming that each facility has to be calculated and achieved once annually in a 12-month period. This was always the intent of the criterion because it's always said that each supplier, facility, and scope needed to meet the thresholds. It's just adding a little bit more clarity here. And then the verification requirements A and B were combined and just clarified, and then the rest were renumbered after that. So verification requirement C became B and so on. So basically the declaration of the 12-month reporting period moved under verification requirement A for the list of all facilities in scope. So again, the same evidence that you've given though is still conformant here. So each supplier facility, you would have provided information on the total renewable energy used and the total energy, the calculation of how much of it was renewable, how they were actually using renewable, all that still applies here. It just is putting these verification requirements together. So because each facility might be buying RECs or doing their generation on a slightly different 12-month reporting period. And then for 4.10.1.1, the title of this criterion was actually updated. It used to be titled Socially Responsible Supplier Manufacturing, and that was a bit confusing because this criterion actually applies to both the EPEAT manufacturer and your suppliers. So that criterion title was updated, and that's been updated in the EPEAT registry as well. EICC references were all updated to RBA. And again, the word comprising was changed to composing in some of the criterion text. And then this is something that just drove me bonkers before, so I'm glad this was changed. But these bullets used to be D and E, even though they were supposed to be A and B. So these have all been corrected now to be the correct bullets for the prioritization assessment. And then there were some places where the criterion text and the verification requirements, they were requiring the same thing, but the language wasn't quite wasn't exactly the same between the two of them. So unlike some of the other criteria we've looked at, these ones, the requirements are the same. They're just a bit of clarification to harmonize between the criterion text and the verification requirement. So this additional clarification was added in the requirements and scope in the criterion text, which matches what was always in the verification requirements. And same here, the verification requirement language, a little bit of extra text was added, which always matched what was in the criterion text. So it doesn't change what was needed for the criterion. Again, it's just really harmonizing between the verification requirement and the criterion text. Oops. And then there is one change, which is significant, but we didn't identify it as needing documentation review. So there's a footnote that now confirms that SA 8000 meets the requirement of the audit program. So the suppliers, for the facilities in scope, needed to be either RBA VAP recognized or included in an audit program, and now clarifies that that certification is acceptable for that audit program. So this does give manufacturers more flexibility in the suppliers that are like how suppliers can demonstrate or how facilities can demonstrate conformance in that supplier audit program. So this criterion does require an annual prioritization assessment. So I just want to remind manufacturers that even if you're not doing an active continuous monitoring or ongoing documentation review, you do need to be doing your annual supplier prioritization assessment. So we're not going to require documentation review of this, but it does just allow for SA 8000 to be used. So when you're doing your next year's assessment, you might be obtaining SA 8000 certifications, and that's completely okay based on this updated language. If you are interested, you can have your CAB review them or keep records of them if you would like. URL was also changed to URLs in the verification requirements. And then 410.1.2 is very, very similar. As I mentioned, the references were changed to RBA, comprising was changed to composing in the text. The bullet numbering was corrected. So these used to say H and I, now they both say A and B again. And then again, this text was added in the criterion text, which matches the verification requirements a bit better. And then this text was added in the verification requirements that matches this criterion text a little bit better and clearer, just that harmonization between the two of them. Documents and URLs were all changed to be plural. And then that's it for this criterion. And the very last change was 410.2.2, or and was changed to and or again. So this criterion requires participation in certain responsible sourcing programs that address capacity building and or improving formalization and access to markets and better conditions for miners. So because this now changes from and to and or, that is a little bit more flexible. So any program you are participating in, we continue to meet this. So that is it. If you do have any questions, you're more than welcome to email or call me. If you have any questions now, I can stop the recording. We can ask them. And if